As seen in metal's previous milestones, the focus has been so far on steering the genre away from the hard rock and blues rock of the classics like Black Sabbath. The idea of the mid-paced stomp that both they and Deep Purple have had in spades is surprisingly lacking as the focus on speed and complex song structures takes over. Thankfully, those who enjoy the old-school pentatonic and slow riffing that made Sabbath the behemoths that they were is alive and well with the first 3 Danzig albums, but also in the subgenre known as doom metal. Now, I'm fully aware that there's everything from death doom to gothic doom and everything in between, but with this video I'm going to be focusing on the traditional kind of doom and 3 major forms of it that arrived around the 1980s. Now, the first wave of Sabbath worship can be traced back to the new wave of British heavy metal, with an underground group called Witchfinder General, a band that I ignored for the previous new wave of British heavy metal chapter because they specifically had influence in the doom metal scene, especially in recent years. However, the material that you'll hear on albums like Death Penalty, it isn't exactly the properly slowed down and really drawn out sound that you would get with the mid-80s American doom bands. Trouble, a band often labelled white metal, as the lyrical concerns were rooted in Christianity, which makes them all the more peculiar. Something else to note is they had 2 self-titled albums, with the one released in 1990 having producer extraordinaire Rick Rubin behind the desk, forcing them to write their leanest material and, as a result, probably being the most accessible album, the best one to start with. Next up, we have Saint Vitus, a group that were miraculously on SST, which was Black Flag's label, and were even produced by Grey Ginn at the beginning. What these guys lack in, say, riffs or the production of Black Sabbath, they make up for in just glorious feedback and a depressing atmosphere. While Dave Chandler is the primary songwriter and sole original member throughout, there is a clear shift once Scott Regers is replaced with Scott Weinrich on vocals. To me, Weinrich, also of the Obsessed and Spirit Caravan fame, is the definitive vocalist for Saint Vitus, as shown on, to me, their best albums, with Born Too Late especially, and also Mournful Cries. The final innovator from the early days that comes from the underground is Pentagram. Quite a sad case, as these guys date all the way back to the early 70s, and a lot of the demos from that time are available on the compilation First Days Here. Highly recommend it, but they were never able to break through in their classic era or release an album until 1985. There are plenty of other traditional doom bands I'd love to cite just before I move on, such as The Obsessed, Pallbearer, Mesa, and of course, Reverend Bizarre. Now on to Epic Doom. Taking influence specifically from the Ronnie James Dio era of Black Sabbath and, by extension, Rainbow, taking it to its logical conclusion, we have Epic Doom, blending the slow, ponderous songwriting with classical elements and more operatic vocals. It's more regal and grand in its execution. The key band to take note of is Candlemass from Sweden, with a rock-solid and influential run of albums from the fittingly titled Epicus Doomicus Metallicus through to Tales of Creation. The essential classic in this run is definitely Nightfall, the debut of second vocalist Messiah Marcolin, and features numerous iconic anthems from them. And then we have the US counterpart to Candlemass in Solitude Aeternus. A description that could be labelled as unfair because these guys debatably shine brighter than Candlemass, not a single dud in their brief but stellar catalogue, and several albums being solid gold classics. This band also features Robert Lowe on vocals, who would later join Candlemass for several albums. One more classic band to mention for this is Sorcerer, who, much like Pentagram, didn't release a full-length album until many years later, but the demo material dates back to the 80s and is essential if you want to hear some OG epic doom. Some other bands to shout out in this category include Chemis, Smolder, Crypt Sermon, and Leif Edling, the main songwriter for Candlemass, has a side project called Avatarium, with a more progressive rock tint. Now time for stoner doom. There's a lot to unpack with this one, as the lines between stoner metal and stoner rock are blurred, with many groups falling into either category. All that's needed to know is that this section largely takes from the Master of Reality and Volume 4 era of Black Sabbath. First up is Sleep. Not exactly a large body of work, but after the more brutal and contorted Volume 1, do you get it? Sleep's Holy Mountain was released to wide acclaim, taking a huge bite off of Sabbath with some psychedelic distortion, a feat all the more impressive as the record was actually a demo that Earache Records released without a proper recording. If you could call any of Sleep works good starting points, I think this one would be it. The other notable album is the single track Behemoth, featuring the 1 hour long song known as Dope Smoker, sporting the best production of their career with its thick, meaty guitar tone that Matt Pike had, and Al Cisneros changing up his vocal style from the anguished Aussie-style vocals towards this more sort of tube and throat singing on this one. No wonder London Records were apprehensive about releasing it in its intended state, but that's what happens when you give two metal-loving potheads free creative control and a mountain of money. Electric Wizard, again with the Sabbath references, are an English stoner doom band that takes a more abrasive and satanic approach compared to Sleep's spaced out and mythological focus. Key albums from the original run include Come My Fanatics and, of course, Dope Throne. And from the later years, the peak is definitely Witch Cult Today, which is probably a better entry point for newcomers. Acid King is another group that are just drenched in fuzz. Laurie S., the sole consistent member, being both the guitarist and singer. Like most classic stoner doom bands, her vocals are more echoey and drift on top of these just large walls of guitar, bass, and drums. I think the album Bussy Woods and 3 are the best ones to go for. Other bands to take note of are Goatsnake, Monolord, Bongzilla, Beelzebong, Church of Misery, Cathedral, the more proggy band Elder, and many, many more. This is definitely one of the richest styles of doom you can dive into. And now finally we get to another key development in doom metal's history, sludge. Getting its origins from Black Flag, the first half of the album My War maybe a slightly more straight-ahead hardcore punk of efforts prior, but the second half features these slow, ugly, feedback-drenched and just toxic-sounding riffs. And later, a group called the Melvins grabbed this sound and pushed it to greater extremes with bizarre phrasing and just the most baffling creative decisions, honestly sounding like they were just trying to alienate any potential audience. Yet this material has had a massive influence on bands like Nirvana, Soundgarden, Tool, Helmet, Mr. Bungle, and many, many more. The sludge developed and then refined by the Melvins, seeing this ugly battle between hardcore and doom led to classic albums like Houdini, Stoner Witch, and Stag, ridiculously experimental albums that, thanks to Kurt Cobain being a fan of them, got them a major record label deal with Atlantic. The Melvins only continued to get more experimental as years went on, playing with 2 drummers, no distortion, noise, stand-up bass, and many, many more quirky deviations. Needless to say, there's a lot to unpack with the Melvins. 2 significant scenes came from what is essentially Melvins worship now. The Louisiana, or more specifically New Orleans, sludge scene of the 90s really boasts the ugliest innovators of the style. Crowbar, I Hate God, Acid Bath, and Down, being a supergroup comprised of members of the first 2, on top of Pepper Keenan of COC and Phil Anselmo of Pantera fame. Then there's the 2000s Georgia scene. The biggest band by far is Mastodon, starting off as a pure sludge group, then getting more and more progressive and melodic, reaching an apex on Crack the Sky. That being said, the sophomore effort, Leviathan, is my favourite. Then there's Baroness, also taking a more melodic approach over time, Kylesa, who's more pulverizing and includes elements of psychedelia, and finally, Black Tusk, who leans strictly towards the hardcore end of things. Then there's the post-metal bands like Neurosis and Isis, which show how expansive this subgenre of a subgenre can become, inviting the post-rock philosophy with the structures and greater focus on dynamics. Sludge has a lot to offer. Finally, when Sleep broke up, it fractured into 2 groups. There's Ohm, comprised of Alan Chris, taking the rhythm section and stripping it down to just the bass, drums, and vocals. Meanwhile, Matt Pike fronts the Motorhead-esque, biting, High on Fire, an incredibly consistent sludge metal band known for just pummeling rhythms and shredding solos, an incredibly consistent band that miraculously won a Grammy. Doom metal as a separate subgenre has proven that metal doesn't need just pure speed or technicality to successfully convey heaviness, and proves that the Sabbath crawl was a feature and not a bug. But if it was a bug, it would have been an eldritch horror bug.